Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Tali Rosenbaum.
And I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn. Today's episode will approach an important topic that's often accompanied by shame. That is, a sexless marriage where the husband is the partner who's reluctant to engage in sexual intercourse. We dealt with a parallel topic in episode 52, which was entitled, Why Doesn't My Wife Want to Have Sex With Me? But while these two issues are related, and we do invite you to listen to episode 52, this episode stands on its own, even without having listened to that earlier podcast.
And we've had many listeners who have written in and said, can you please do an episode on when there is a desire discrepancy, but the wife wants more than the husband? What it reminds me of is when I began studying sex counseling and sex therapy many, many years ago, it was very common for the lecturer to show a slide. And when I became a lecturer, I also used to show the slide, even though I never really connected to it. And what they would show would be this very complicated machine with all kinds of knobs and switches and wires. And they would say, this is female sexuality. Then they would show another machine, and all it was an on-off switch. This is male sexuality. So for many years, the myth about male sexuality, that it's really very simple and all they need to do is turn on and they're ready to go, and women are much more complicated, this myth has been perpetuated even by the profession.
So Tali, the fact that you also showed this slide shows that you also believe this myth at one point.
For a little while, until I really began practicing and realized that men are just as vulnerable and just as complex as women. When the man doesn't want sex as much as the woman, there seems to be more shame about it. The discourse around it is quieter. Really, women and men feel shamed and feel embarrassed when the situation is. Often women take it personally and they feel as though their husband is just not attracted to them, doesn't want them. But there really are many reasons why a man might be ambivalent or withdraw or avoid sexual intimacy. And they're often very nuanced and layered. They have to do with their own individual psychological factors. It can be relational. It can be based on physiological issues, cultural, spiritual, religious. I think we can talk about all of those.
Okay, we'll get to that conversation in just a moment. First, remember to check out the website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikveh checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, rate and review, and leave a comment. We're also working on additional projects for Intimate Judaism so that we can expand our reach. Please, therefore, make sure to tell people about Intimate Judaism and share the podcast so that we can continue to grow our audience. Get ready for an Intimate Judaism mini-series for young people entitled Intimacy and Sexuality for Emerging Adults. It's geared towards teenagers and young adults aged 18 and up, and is coming soon. Look for further announcements on the Intimate Judaism website, as well as on the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group on Facebook.
Let's start by talking about this concept of sexless marriage before we dive in specifically to male desire. And I do want to point out that there are many couples who are in sexless marriages for whom that's okay. It's not really a big source of distress for either of them. And we could talk about what those reasons might be, but really, I think for the most part, either one partner, and usually both partners, are distressed by the fact that there is no sexual intimacy in the marriage. I wonder if you could start out by talking about what do you think Judaism says about chosen sexlessness or not chosen.
Okay, Tali, I will give a more detailed halachic analysis in a little bit, but right now, just to give an overview, the basic idea is that Judaism does not look at it very positively. In fact, there's a pasuk in the Torah, which is She'ira ksuta vonata lo yigras, from Parshat Mishpatim. It's from the 21st chapter of Shemot. And that means that a husband must not withhold certain things from his wife. What those things are is actually a machloket, an argument. However, everyone agrees that at least one of them is sexual intercourse. Because of that, this idea that a husband can somehow voluntarily choose to withhold sex is considered an an actual prohibition in the Torah. It's more nuanced than that. I'm not going to pretend that that's the end of the story. But the basic idea here is that there is an obligation by Torah law for a husband to give his wife sexual intercourse. So when I say give his wife, in that sense, it really is a matter of the husband's obligation towards his wife. There is a question among the postgame about whether or not the wife has an equivalent requirement towards the husband, a parallel obligation to also give him sex. That's an open question, which is addressed by different people, but everyone agrees the husband must do it for his wife. So for that reason, it's not quite so simple to say they can choose to have a sexless marriage. Halachically, that does cause certain problems. Listeners are encouraged to go back to an early episode, episode 9, where we talked about this in more depth. We discussed there the idea of sexual obligation. Moreover, Tali, I think it's important to point out, and I'm fully cognizant of the fact that this may not be comforting to people who are in a sexless marriage, but I want to be open and obvious and deliberate about the sources. Chazal, our sages, do speak about sex as a central part of marriage, not a side perk. In fact, in many ways, you can show sources that show that in a certain way of thinking, it is the central part of a marital relationship, which I'll explain in just a moment. For example, in Shabbat, page 33b, there's a line that says, everyone knows why a bride enters the chuppah, the marriage canopy. And it's referring to the fact that she's going to have sex. That's in the context of tzniut, in the context of modesty, and how you shouldn't talk about it. Everyone knows why this is happening. Moreover, I'm going to quote Rav Melamed from Har Bracha, who wrote in one of his halacha books, and I'm translating myself, everyone agrees that the mitzvah of onah, that refers to the mitzvah of a couple having sexual intercourse together, is the essential point of the marriage, because through it, the complete love between them is expressed. Moreover, Tali, without getting into all the details, on a recent episode of my podcast, Orthodox Conundrum, with Rabbi Menachem Penner and Rabbi Yaakov Horowitz, it was made clear by my guests that while sex isn't the centerpiece of a marriage, without it, the rest of the relationship loses a certain gravitas, a certain type of meaning. What makes a marriage is, according to Chazal, very much the fact that it also involves sexual intercourse, even if sex isn't the centerpiece of the marriage. So for all of this, what I'm saying really is that when a husband avoids sex, it's not a simple matter. And even though, as I said, it is more nuanced than I presented right now, this is a very one-sided view. At the same time, we can't pretend that the Torah viewpoint is that a sexless marriage is perfectly fine. It really isn't.
So I appreciate you talking about sexuality in the context of obligation, because it really allows us to segue into what it is like for men. In addition to so many of the other pressures and obligations, turning sex into an obligation as well could be one of the salient reasons why they might withdraw or avoid, because turning something like sexuality, which is generally based on desire, to something that's obligated and making them feel as though they're always ready and willing, so it shouldn't be a problem to provide, quote unquote, it. I believe that that creates additional pressures, and that could be one of the many reasons why men could be avoiding.
Let me just add one point, though. While what you said right now is definitely true, it should be noted that in Masechet Ketubot in the Mishnah, it is not quite true that everyone has to be available at all times. While it is true that a wife can ask her husband for sex, and that's actually his obligation to provide it, the Mishnah also says that people have sex based on what they do with their lives, their professions, their emotional state, etc., based on certain time constraints. It's not as simple as they have to always be available. Sometimes it's 2 weeks, sometimes it's a month, whatever it could be. So it's not quite as simple as they must do it all the time.
So let's talk about kind of the lived experience, though, of couples, and particularly when the male partner does not seem to be as interested, is not initiating sex. And I think we really want to understand the complex layers of those conflicts and what's going on there. So let's name the myth. And the myth really is that men are always eager and always ready and always want to have sex. And I think that we need to really recognize that male sexuality is complex, and that for religious men, there's additional layers of complexity around sexuality because of how they developed sexually, around their own arousal, around the restrictions, around fulfilling that arousal, even with self-stimulation, masturbation being prohibited. And so I think that what we really want to understand is that if I'm speaking now to women who are listening, when and if your partner, your male partner, your husband, is withdrawing from sex or doesn't seem interested in sex, don't think or don't jump to the conclusion that he isn't attracted to you. There really isn't a single explanation, but there are some common kind of pathways towards sexual ambivalence and avoidance that I think that we can talk about.
Okay, Tali, so let's explore some of those pathways. Can you go through them for us?
This isn't going to be an exhaustive list, but I thought about maybe 4 main pathways towards male avoidance. And one would be kind of like avoidant attachment. Some men, they may kind of internalize the message that I don't want to burden my wife with my sexual needs. When she wants to have sex with me, she'll ask me. Otherwise, if I'm asking her, I'm going to be risking rejection, or I'm going to feel rejected if she doesn't want to. And maybe there were times in the past where I didn't know that she didn't want it or didn't like it. We didn't have that kind of communication. And so I found out later that there were many times that we had sex and she didn't enjoy it, or realizing that she didn't enjoy it. And now I've just kind of held back. If my wife isn't showing me enthusiasm and desire, then I don't think I want to take the risk. They kind of get the feeling that their needs are burdensome. That may have to do with their earlier upbringing, kind of learning early in life that if they want anything, they're better off not asking, maybe taking care of their needs by themselves. They also might be picking up on their wife's cues and interpreting them as you obviously don't want me. And they might be waiting for like the perfect conditions, which really never come. There isn't like a lot of communication around it. And so they might even be desiring, but not initiating, and then feeling frustrated, and then feeling resentful, and then blaming their wives about it.
What I find fascinating, and it's not a good thing, but this is so different from the common myth, the common assumptions that people often have in our world about male sexuality, that the man, as you said, is a simple machine and he always wants it and he's ready to go. And this idea that somehow he has this deep vulnerability and a fear of rejection is so different from the way that our common perceptions are of human beings, about men in the Western world.
Absolutely. And also the idea that men have to perform. Men have to know what to do, and they have to do it well. And that can also be a real burden on men. And this kind of ties into what they might be feeling towards their wives that they're not really communicating. Let's say they are not feeling so confident, or they are having some anxiety about their sexual functioning. So, for example, a man who has premature ejaculation, he gets very excited, and within like a second or two, he just ejaculates before really he has time to stay in the moment, to create a longer intercourse situation. And he might feel, if we had more intercourse, if we had sex more frequently, then I would be in control. Think about it. Many men don't really feel like they have agency over their bodies when it comes to their sexuality. Their whole lives, they were told that you really should avoid any sort of sexual arousal because obviously becoming aroused and then having prohibited sex would be bad. Masturbating would be bad. So really the only way to express your sexuality is in marriage. So then when you're in marriage, you want to be able to express your sexuality, but it's not just up to you. Your wife also has to be willing and consenting and in the mood and wanting. And that doesn't always happen either. And so you're kind of dependent and you feel like you don't have a sense of control or a sense of mastery of your body because your opportunities are so few.
And I'll also add that in very many yeshivot, in certain educational contexts, definitely not all, of course, but this idea of not having arousal because it might lead to forbidden sex or to masturbation is more than that. In fact, the arousal itself is considered sinful. I'm not going to get into specific stories, but I have heard directly stories from people about rabbis talking about how very admirable it is if a person doesn't even get aroused during the day, which implies that the converse is also true. If a person does get aroused, there's something not so good about that. We have to be careful. Obviously, we're not changing the halakha, but if we over-obsess about making sure that people don't get aroused, a natural human function, then they're going to have a very difficult time later on, at least potentially, when they suddenly have to turn that entirely on its head. When that which was completely and absolutely asur, prohibited, and was the worst thing, so to speak, a single man can do, suddenly becomes a mitzvah. It's really difficult for a person to make that change. I'm not advocating that a person intentionally get aroused. What I mean is that if we obsess about it, if we make it this super important aspect of the religiosity, when it happens unintentionally, it's some sort of problem, or at least by implication that's the case, then we're going to make it very difficult for them later on.
Well, you're bringing up something so important, and that really leads us to the next two pathways, which are the trauma pathway and then the religious shame and guilt pathway. And it's all related, because if we talked about attachment and avoidance and not wanting to burden our partner, our wives, and then we talked about sexual function in men. Now, what you brought up is this idea of arousal in the past, even being a trigger, because when you're young and you have arousal and you recognize and realize that arousal is going to kind of quote unquote get you in trouble. It's an uh-oh moment. Now what am I going to do? Either I have to get rid of it, or I might end up masturbating and feel bad and guilty about it. And so a lot of these situations end up creating a wiring in your body that when you are aroused, it automatically triggers this uh-oh feeling. And if you're a young man who's been taught that spilling seed is equivalent to murdering hundreds of thousands of potential souls, then that can in itself create trauma. Every time you get aroused, that feeling is wired in with this horrible feeling of conflict and moral injury and trauma. And also, kind of relating to sexual dysfunction and premature ejaculation, what might be the connection is that when you were young and single and became aroused, you would maybe masturbate very quickly in order to get rid of the arousal. And that the arousal response and the quick ejaculation after that would then leave you feeling very down. Many men report that after they masturbate, they feel bad. They feel like an imposter. They feel like they can't walk into the Beit Midrash, the Beis Medrash, or the shul because I'm this rabbis, people look at them and they respect them, but they don't respect themselves. They feel like they're imposters. They have this kind of down. So what happens is that in marriage, they can be wired in such a way that the ejaculation response happens so quickly from the first arousal, because that's kind of how they wired their system in order to get rid of the arousal. And so in marriage, when they're trying to function sexually with their wives, they just go too quickly and they don't really get to sit in the arousal for a long time in order to build it up, in order to feel mastery, in order to feel empowered, in order to feel like they have the opportunity to create pleasure for their wives. Because when men are able to hold on to their erection for a long enough time to ensure their wives' pleasure, or to let intercourse last long enough so that their wives can figure out how to position themselves or how to begin to really enjoy it, they don't have that opportunity. And so it becomes a cycle. You feel as though you're a failure. And when you feel like you're a failure, you don't want to continue. Or if you have sex and the feeling of down that you had when you masturbated is the same, you expect something different. You expect that the sex you have with your partner, with your wife, when you are connecting and when you are loving each other and when you are feeling pleasure and pleasuring each other, you expect that you're going to feel energized. You're going to feel good afterwards. And many men do report that, men who feel mastery over their sexual functioning. But men who don't, or men who feel like they're wife doesn't want it, doesn't like it, is just saying, do what you have to do and just be done already, which is also a dynamic that creates this feeling and creates this avoidance in men, because men don't want to have sex with a woman who's doing them a favor or who's just laying there and kind of being there for them so that they can do what they need to do. Men don't want that. They want a real kind of mutual experience.
I want to actually cite a Gemara, Tali. I admit that I'm being somewhat creative over here, but at the same time, it's very interesting. If you look at Masechet Nedarim, which talks about different types of promises and oaths and vows, there are examples there that are given of a husband who makes a vow not to get pleasure from sex from his wife. And the Gemara talks about whether or not that's valid, because on the one hand, as I already mentioned, it's an obligation. He has to give his wife sex, so therefore you can't make a vow that goes against the Torah. But he might say it in such a way that it's not that I'm not going to give you sex. Rather, I'm promising not to get pleasure from the sex you give me or something, whatever the exact language is over there. Now, on the one hand, we could look at a Gemara like this and simply say it's giving examples, maybe extreme examples, and these are not practical examples in any real way. And the Gemara is not trying to say people actually ever said this. Very often, the Mishnah or the Gemara will give extreme cases in order to delineate the contours or the limits of how far a certain type of vow goes. And it's not meant to talk about a real life scenario. But if we want to be creative, we can talk about a real life scenario over here. Maybe it is talking about something that actually happened. We don't know. And if a husband actually makes that kind of vow not to get pleasure from sex that his wife gives him, as you were speaking, that's what I was thinking about. I was thinking, wow, I wonder if that explains these kinds of emotional reactions, this kind of trauma, this kind of sense of I can't be aroused. I wonder if that's the source of someone who might say something like this, because I always thought of that as just, as I said, an extreme example that's not real. But from what you're saying, maybe there were men who actually felt, I can't let myself feel that pleasure.
I think that's interesting. Most men and men who have had trauma as well, and we're going to talk about trauma in a moment, they do want to be able to feel pleasure, and they're not choosing to have shut down response or kind of a numbness or an avoidance. They're not really choosing that. We don't really choose trauma responses. But it's an interesting Gemara from the point of view of why a man would want to deny himself pleasure. And I think that that's what you are talking about here. And that might be more values-based with maybe distorted values, distorted feeling that we think about sex as something that we should abstain from. That's more of a Christian value, perhaps.
Or that the pleasure itself is somehow sinful.
Or that the pleasure is sinful. Look, I think that there are some Hasidic sects that until today try to minimize the idea of pleasure in sexuality. But I also believe that most Jewish sources expect that sex be a pleasurable activity between a man and his wife. I think that most of the time, what I'm talking about here are men who really do want to be able to have pleasure and have pleasure with their wives, and they struggle. I mean, there's so many reasons, and we kind of touched on them. Having difficulties with your sexual functioning, sometimes even having trouble holding an erection, or sometimes having trouble reaching an orgasm. We'd call that delayed ejaculation, where you're kind of staying in a semi-aroused state, but you're not able to finish. Sometimes men feel very overwhelmed with the intimacy involved in sexuality, the emotional intimacy involved in sexuality. And so that might cause them to withdraw.
Okay, Tali, let's move forward into the next pathway that leads sometimes to a sexless marriage from the perspective of the man.
Yeah, so I'm talking about 4 different pathways, but obviously as we're speaking, we can acknowledge and appreciate that they're all interwoven. Let's talk a little bit about trauma, especially because, at least here in Israel, couples therapists and sex therapists are seeing a lot of issues with couples around sexuality and intimacy because of men who have come back from war with a lot of trauma and a lot of moral injury. And I'm not going to kind of go into all the details, but let's just say it this way. Intimacy requires one to be completely relaxed and to be able to let go and to be able to kind of be in the experience. What happens with war and trauma and post-trauma is that your body is in a state of hypervigilance. Your nervous system is constantly aroused. You're not emotionally regulated. War does that. Trauma does that. So when you are kind of in a state of not really being able to relax, it's very hard to get into an intimate situation. It's hard to be able to have sex because your body needs to relax. It needs to be able to be intimate. Intimacy can actually feel threatening because it keeps you off guard, and you kind of are wired to be on guard. Does that make sense?
Yes, I do understand that. I think that people often, though, believe sort of the opposite, that if you're stressed out, having sex can relax you. You're saying it really works the other way around. You have sex after you already are relaxed.
Now, let me explain it this way. Sex does relax you, but what happens when you get there is that your body goes into kind of like a heightened response. When an individual, man or a woman, is sexually excited, they have responses in their body. Their heart rate increases, their blood flow increases, and they know that these are normal responses to sexual excitation. And they know that they're going to have pleasure and they're going to reach an orgasm, and then they'll feel good and they'll feel relaxed. If you have been traumatized, if you have post-traumatic stress, for example, your body, when it gets excited, it's not able to really access the part of the brain that says, hey, calm down, this is great, this is just sex. When they get triggered by the heart rate, for example, rising and the blood flow going, they feel like it's a stress response. It doesn't just feel like sexual excitement. It actually feels like they're in a stress response, which is about fight, flight, freeze, and they're not really able to access what we call the down regulators, the parts of their brain that says, relax, this is fine, you're just having sex, it's all good. And so all of that can be very overwhelming for somebody who has trauma to be sexually excited, because when they get sexually excited, their whole system gets overly excited. And
it's almost like system overload, it sounds like.
It's like system overload. Usually they'll shut down, but they could even go into a state of flashback. And so that is a reason why they'll avoid sex. And so what happens with couples often is that what's happening is that there's no sex between them. But then let's say the woman will find that he's been watching pornography. And then they'll come in and she'll say, he doesn't want me. He doesn't want to have sex with me. Ever since he's been back from the army, I would think that he would want to be with me. And then instead I found him watching pornography. And what she needs to understand is that pornography is not a substitute for sex. He's accessing the pornography for numbing, for self-soothing, because it's just something that doesn't require him to be intimate. Intimacy requires presence. It requires thinking about the other person, making sure they're having a good time. And that's just too much for some men to handle when they've been through such difficult traumatic experiences.
That's so interesting, because I would think that most people would say if a man is looking at pornography and he's not interested in sex with his wife, then her assumption that you mentioned a little while back, that he just isn't attracted to me, is true. He's looking at something that does attract him. And you're saying that's just not what's going on at all.
I think that could be true as well, Scott. I mean, in a therapeutic context, we're always going to want to try to understand what are the motivations, what the porn does for the person. I'm just bringing an example of when porn is used kind of as a self-soothing mechanism for somebody who really doesn't have what it takes to be so intimate, to be so vulnerable. The eye contact is vulnerable. And so withdrawing from sex with a partner feels very protective. You know, sex is very much the opposite of survival. Trauma teaches the body to prioritize protection and survival, not pleasure. And so in order to really be in a state of pleasure, we really sort of have to be able to be in more of a mode of not running for our lives.
I know there's a fourth pathway that you wanted to speak about. Again, these aren't the only pathways, but these are those that you prepared. So why don't you mention the next one you have in mind?
Look, I think that we touched on this, and this really has to do with religious messages, shame, conflict. I think that we see many different ways in which young religious men have dealt with their very normative sexual curiosity and sexual arousal. So I've actually met men who have completely shut it down. They will say to me, I never masturbated. The minute I understood that you're not allowed, I just never accessed that. And so they sort of went into a complete sexual shutdown, or they just never masturbated. They still had arousal, but they actually were able to completely stop themselves from doing anything. So we said before that arousal can be a trigger from the past. They may have difficulty keeping an erection. They might feel guilty. And then this idea of sex being something that feels depleting, that instead of feeling alive and vibrant, there's so much shame after ejaculation that it kind of mirrors the old feeling of conflict and shame with masturbation. And then again, going into the performance quote unquote issue. I don't like to say performance because sex is not a performance. But when we talk about the man feeling like he needs to function well in order to please his wife, will it be meaningful for her? Is my body okay? What we don't consider is that very similarly to what women often experience around sexuality, maybe some conflicts around their body image or feelings of, am I good enough? Am I attractive enough? Men can feel the same way.
You've already mentioned sexual functioning a few times. What would be some other reasons for low sexual functioning?
Well, sexual desire can be affected by psychological issues, depression, anxiety. Even ADHD can affect sexuality because you just can't stay focused. Certainly medical conditions, certain medications. If you're diabetic or you have low testosterone, high blood pressure, chronic pain, not getting enough sleep, being exhausted from parenting, just like mothers can be exhausted from parenting. Again, having some difficulties around emotional regulation, overusing pornography. If you have any conflicts about your sexual orientation, you might have some relational intimacy issues which affect your ability to be sexual. So there's really a lot of different contributors to what could be causing, and I'm sure that I have not given the exhaustive list. I'm happy to talk a little bit too about treatments, although I would refer you back to a previous episode that we had with Shai Krug on the types of treatments that are available for specific male sexual dysfunctions. But I think it is important to briefly talk about how if you are suffering from erectile problems or premature ejaculation, or you feel like you might have a decreased level of sexual desire, as I said before on the episode with women, there's always going to be a relational component, whether that comes as a result of not wanting sex or whether it's what creates the desire discrepancy in sex. But if we put aside relational issues for a moment, we really should look into what could be the physical factors and look into ways that they can be treated. There are exercises that can be done. There are devices that could be used. There are medications that could be taken. So I would very much urge you to see a physician, a urologist, a sexologist, a sex therapist to help kind of look at what can be done to help treat these conditions.
Tali, what I'm hearing from you is very clearly that when a man, quote unquote, doesn't want to have sex, it's not necessarily that he doesn't want to have sex. It's that there are so many different reasons that might be making it very difficult for him to have that kind of relationship, even if it's something which he really wants a lot.
Exactly.
Let's move forward into a brief halachic discussion now. The reason that I want to do this now, Tali, is that until now, we have spoken very deliberately about a very serious conflict. The fact that on the one hand, there are couples that are experiencing a sexless marriage and the husband is the quote unquote reason. He's the person who does not want to have sex. And the very serious problem that the Torah says a husband must provide that for his wife. The reason it's particularly important to look at the halachot in this situation is that while it is true that there is a Torah obligation, a halachic obligation for the husband to provide sexual intercourse for his wife, within a marriage, the halachic situation is somewhat more nuanced. We'll look at the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah in order to demonstrate this nuance. Let's start with the serious obligation that he has. The Rambam points out that if a husband makes a deal with his wife, they actually agree in advance that we're going to get married, but there's not going to be any sex, that T'nai, that condition is batel. It doesn't work because a person is not allowed to make a condition that violates or goes against what the Torah itself demands. On the other hand, let me now cite a Rambam in Hilchot Ishut, the 14th chapter, the 7th halacha, because this is a little bit different. If we look at the words of the Rambam, he says there, it is forbidden for a man to hold back sex from his wife. Limnoa ishto onata. Ve'imana kidei l'sa'ara. If he does this in order to cause her agony or pain, avar below ta'aseh shel Torah, that is a Torah violation. The Rambam deliberately puts in that word, if he doesn't have sex in order to make it difficult for her. Similarly, in Sefer HaMitzvot, also written by the Rambam, in Mitzvat Lo Ta'aseh 262, the Rambam says that a husband is prohibited from holding back a woman's food, clothing, or his sexual obligation to her if he's doing it in order to cause her pain or annoyance. In other words, The Rambam is not saying that not having sex in the marriage is itself a prohibition. Rather, it is a prohibition only if it's done only to antagonize the wife. So that gives a little bit more nuance. So yes, it is true there is a Torah obligation to have sex with one's wife. And it also is true that the husband cannot make a condition that this will be a sexless marriage before they get married. However, if that's just what ends up happening and it's not intentional and it's not done in order to antagonize the wife, it's done for all of the reasons that you just mentioned before, there's no prohibition in that. That does change things a little bit, because even though a person can't go into the marriage saying, yeah, we're not going to have sex, I think in the vast majority of situations that you're talking about, that was never the plan. As you said, the husband very much wants to have sex with his wife, and there are outside or internal factors that are preventing him, and that is not a Torah prohibition.
That's so important what you're saying, because this whole discussion needs to be had with a great deal of compassion and a great deal of empathy for both partners. You talked about, what happens when there isn't sex and he's the reason. As couples therapists, we talk about who's the identified patient, and we don't really want to create a situation where only one person is quote unquote to blame. We don't blame either partner. There might be one person that has certain issues with sexual function, but we look at the couple as a dynamic. Both partners come in and we look at the couple as the identified patient and not one person being responsible. What you were saying before about holding back on sex purposely in a way that is meant to create suffering, that is certainly one very difficult dynamic that the Torah is not allowing. But what you're also saying is, hey, we understand that this isn't being done on purpose, that men are human, just like women are human. When a woman can't and she's too tired or she's not in the mood, of course, that's fine. Sex also always has to be consensual. And that's true for men too. And so what we want to really recognize is how difficult. I mean, the women who write to us asking us to do an episode are filled with so much pain. They're lonely. They want to be able to be intimate and create a connection, a sexual connection with their husbands, and it's not happening. And it's the same for both partners. And I think that we should really talk about how do couples navigate this situation? How do they do it rather than doing it with anger and resentment and conflict and fighting about it, which creates only more distance? How do we kind of navigate this sexual conflict with compassion and understanding?
And as you said earlier, it very often is a problem that this can be a vicious cycle. When someone says that this is asur, this is prohibited, but I'm doing it anyway. Let's say he can't have sex with his wife in his own mind, and then he realizes that he's violating and he's sort of right, a Torah prohibition. That makes the stress even stronger, and thereby even makes it more difficult for him to actually have sexual intercourse. Once we give ourselves a little bit of compassion and say, hey, the Rambam says it's kedei litza'ara. It's only prohibited if he's doing it in order to punish her in some way, in order to antagonize her, to annoy her. If that's not what's going on there, if it's for other reasons, there is no prohibition. It is not something which you have to be upset about or feel guilty about or klap al chet about on Yom Kippur. Once that is taken away, maybe some of the shame involved and the additional shame, the religious shame, can be removed so that we can deal with the issue directly between the husband and the wife without adding that additional factor of the religious guilt. Maybe that's a good transition, Tali, to talk about how couples can navigate this then.
Absolutely, because holding that over his head and saying, but it's mitzvah ona and you owe it to me, and how dare you not give it to me, is probably not going to be the best way to go about trying to...
That's probably not an effective methodology, I would guess.
No, just like it's not effective the other way around. And we've talked about wedding night trauma, and we've talked about reasons why women avoid sex. And men also have wedding night trauma. I work with a lot of Hasidic couples. I work with Hasidic men who have felt that the experience that they were put into when they knew nothing about this and they had to do it, and they were told that they have to do it on the wedding night. And even if it's hard for her, and even if she, has trouble and you have to do the mitzvah as soon as possible, they carry a lot of trauma. They carry a lot of trauma from the beginning. And it was hard for them as well, very difficult for them. And so we want to be able to create a lot of communication, a lot of healing, an atmosphere of compassion and understanding. Also, not personalizing it. Usually, for the most part, your husband's withdrawal is not about you not being attractive to him. And I think what we want to do is shift away from self-blame or from blaming him and move towards curiosity, trying to really understand what's going on for him. Try to evoke and validate his vulnerability, because it could be trauma-based, and it could be based on lack of self-confidence, or it could be based on other issues that are going on for him, where you might be able to help him by validating his vulnerability, turning down the pressure and the goal. Sometimes the pressure is really high, especially when she wants to have a baby. And he feels it. He feels like all the time that you were nursing, or that after you weren't interested. Now all of a sudden you want another baby, and now you're so interested. And he feels like all this pressure on him to perform. So understanding that you can talk about these things, you're not expected to be an object that's providing sperm. This is something that we do together out of love and connection and desire.
As you mentioned earlier, I think it's important to reemphasize this important point, which is that this idea that men are always capable and therefore they should always be available is not something which, at least as far as I know, is found in Chazal. It's not something which I think has a Torah source to it. In fact, I think even in the Western world, it's a relatively modern assumption. As we've mentioned in other episodes, Tali, the idea that women are always capable and men are not was actually a more common assumption in the public mind. It's more of a modern 20th and 21st century idea that the man has to be powerful and ready to go. That's a new idea and not an ancient idea. It's certainly not based in Torah.
Well, and now we know that not anybody is just always ready to go. We're all human, and we all need the context that we need in order to be able to make that space for being sexual. And so what can you do as the female partner? Well, first, like I said, you want to shift away from blame, whether it's self-blame or blaming him, to this kind of shared curiosity. Like when we talked about the woman not wanting, I said, don't ask why she doesn't want, ask what does she want? And I think that here you don't want to ask, why don't you want me? But you might want to say, what might make sex feel better for you, easier for you, more inviting? And you can communicate about it without placing pressure. How can we make it feel good for both of us? What helps you feel close to me? Is there anything that would make this easier for you? So you can validate his vulnerability, because men carry a lot of private shame. And a man hearing from his wife that I really want to and I really love to explore this with you can really soften the dynamic. Maybe also slowing down the pace, because men with a lot of performance anxiety, they need a less goal-oriented approach and something that's gentle. We can do whatever we can do. It doesn't have to be perfect. I just want to be together. We can even just cuddle, see what happens. And so this is what we like to call erotic empathy. Erotic empathy means, tuning into his fears, celebrating when he does have desire, allowing him time to warm up, reinforcing safety through your tone and your presence, and reducing the pressure of obligation or immediacy, and also encouraging and normalizing and looking for help together. I think a lot of couples, especially here in Israel during the war and after, we are dealing with a lot of couples who are having difficulty with the reestablishment of intimacy and are going to couples therapy, are going to sex therapy. And we're seeing this, and I'm sure that it's not uncommon, and I'm sure that it's not uncommon even outside of Israel.
As we get closer to the end of this conversation, there's an important point that we have to address, because until now, we've been talking almost exclusively about a husband and a wife who don't have sex because the husband has all of these various internal or external factors that are preventing him. And we have said repeatedly, it's not that he's not attracted to her, it's because of X, Y, or Z. But what happens when he actually is not attracted to her? What if the reason really is that he simply says, I'm no longer attracted to my wife? Is there any hope for that couple?
Yeah, look, that's not terribly uncommon. It can be the case. I think that in the couples that I've seen and in the men that I've seen, not being attracted to their wives holds a great deal of shame for them. It's not something that they have an easy time admitting. And usually it requires a process of therapy to try to understand better about what's happening. Is there an aversion? Is there something that they're being turned off by? Is this maybe relational? Because, we all change. We all gain weight or get older. And, couples who love each other and who love who each other are usually not that put off. But sometimes there are some changes that can occur that definitely create decreased attraction. And part of dealing with that is communicating, seeing what can be changed. Some things can be changed. If your wife's not brushing her teeth, and she can just start brushing her teeth and putting some mouthwash, and then you've solved the problem. It's very practically a solvable problem. And sometimes it's not that easy to change certain things. And I think it's really something that needs to be talked about. Unfortunately, there are some couples where the attraction wasn't there even from the beginning. And there's a lot of reasons for that. And it could be that they were pressured to get married, or there really is a sexual orientation issue that wasn't ever addressed and that maybe should be addressed. So ongoing lack of attraction in a marriage is something that should be brought to a couples and sex therapist, because it can be very, very painful for both partners. So I'm glad that you did bring that up, because otherwise we would have ignored that issue. And it's definitely there as well.
This isn't exactly the same case, but at the end of the 9th parak of Masachet Nedarim, there's a situation where it talks about if somebody made a promise, a vow, not to marry somebody because she's ugly, but she's actually beautiful, then the vow is invalid and he's allowed to marry her. And it gives an example of Rabbi Ishmael, who was involved in a case where a person said he's not going to marry a certain girl because she's ugly, and he beautified her. And he went to the man and said, "Is this the woman that you promised not to marry?" He goes, "No, she's a different person." And Rabbi Ishmael permitted him to marry her because in practice, the neder, the vow, had been a mistake. And at that point, Rabbi Ishmael cried and said, "The people of Israel, the women of Israel, they're so beautiful, but poverty makes them ugly." And on some level, what you're saying now reminds me of that. There's a fundamental beauty that lies underneath, but circumstances can change that. Doesn't mean, however, that the beauty isn't really there. And bringing it to what you're talking about, in our situation, we're talking about a husband who hopefully was once attracted to his wife. Things have happened, and that attraction is no longer there. From his perspective, the beauty that he fell in love with is no longer there. But Rabbi Ishmael is saying it's still there underneath. If we look carefully, it's still there. And if they have a relationship based on commitment, hopefully they can find again that which originally caused that attraction.
I think that that's a beautiful mashal, because in marriage, especially when you're young and beautiful, there's this idea of attraction and passion. But in a long-term relationship, we love one another, not because there are no wrinkles there or no rolls of fat there. They're there, and we still love each other because of everything that we've gone through, and we're still committed. I think this really speaks to long-term commitment. And so sometimes it takes a process to be able to reconnect in that way. And sometimes it takes a need for a therapist to sit with you in the office and help you get there. I'm hoping that this episode, Scott, will help couples, even those who don't end up going to therapy, because not everybody needs to go to therapy or can afford to go to therapy. But I hope that this episode really opens up the communication for couples, that they could talk to each other, that they can be vulnerable with each other, and that they can even say, it's not that I don't want to be with you, and it's not that I don't love you. I'm having some issues. I'm having some difficulties. Maybe we can even talk about them.
So you're saying that communication is important. Wow, that's a new idea, I guess.
Did I not say that yet? Did I not say that on every episode?
I'm very pleased. After 66 episodes, you finally said that for the first time.
Communication. You didn't say anything about Rav Soloveitchik, so we're even.
Okay, good. So we're both doing Chidushim today. Thank you, everybody, for listening to this important episode of Intimate Judaism. Remember to subscribe. Go to our website, intimatejudaism.com, and look soon for Intimacy and Sexuality for Emerging Adults, our mini-series. Thank you for joining us.
Bye.